Alright guys, let us talk about the biggest mystery of the Wano Kuni arc. And no, I'm not talking about the biggest mystery of plot or the biggest mystery of the characters. I'm talking about Wano, the country itself, and how the hell Luffy even got there to begin with. Hey YouTube, Joeboy here. So, I think for the purposes of persuasiveness, and just so that you guys can recall in case you have forgotten, I need to explain essentially the very beginning of the Wano Kuni arc. And how exactly Luffy and company ended up in Wano. Even though we don't know that answer, we got to see several other things beforehand, and very important information was revealed. So let's go over it. So at the beginning of chapter 910 of One Piece, the Strats that traveled to Whole Cake Island, we can see them on the ship. The weather outside seems fine, the seas are calm, and they're happily discussing various stuff from the news. But this quickly changes. As they near the entrance of Wano, Nami points out that the winds have gotten stronger and the waves have been growing in size as well, and Oda actually depicts this. It's worth pointing out, guys, that you have these columns of rock that stick up out of the ocean, very similar to the very same formations we can see from Wano itself. Meanwhile, they seem to be heading into what appears to be some kind of great storm. The sky is blocked out and it is overly misty. At this point, Nami had this to say: the truth is, Kinemon warned us about this. Kinemon then says in a flashback, there's a bend. This is important, guys. There is a bend. Well, I'll explain it using the snail when you get there, but it's one of Wano country's barriers of entry. The country is always surrounded by terrible weather. Furthermore, the waves are rough and the currents move very rapidly. It's at this point that they really start to see the effects that Kinemon was talking about. I want to point this out. In this panel, right before it all begins, we can see coming up from below the ocean itself, Bubble Bubble. Then the Sunny is carried away on a massive and later clarified freshwater stream, full of, as Sanji points out to us, freshwater carp. Somehow a freshwater stream exists below the ocean itself. I believe that this is what is indicated by Oda specifically creating a panel which says Bubble Bubble. Later on in the chapter, Brook offers us a speculation as to the origin of this fresh water. He thinks that it is so clear it reminds him of the fresh water that flows down a mountain. I personally believe that Brook's speculation is either the truth or very, very close to it. And it honestly makes a lot of sense because, as we could see later on in Wano itself, it does contain very strange, extremely tall mountains. But going back to chapter 910 of One Piece, they're carried along this freshwater stream through the ocean for some amount of time until they reach a waterfall, an upside down, a wrong side, a reverse waterfall. The stream is so powerful it goes up the side of this mountain. And when they reach the top, they find a whirlpool, which, as we learn in chapter 911 of One Piece, sucked both the Sunny and Luffy down. The next thing that Luffy knows, he is washed upon the shores of Wano. So I'm sure you guys are interested to hear my crazy idea. So let's get into it. And so I suppose I want to start here with probably what is the most persuasive bit of evidence, which will at least get you along the same train of thought and leave you open to discussing other things. The first of which is, guys, the freshwater stream took them to the top of, went up the waterfall on top, and you have a whirlpool which sucked Luffy in and down. As far as I can tell, this whirlpool is permanent and huge. Straight up, Luffy should have drowned. The whirlpool would suck him under into the ocean itself, where he would not be able to breathe. On top of his devil fruit limitations. Somehow Luffy and the Sunny were sucked into a whirlpool that led into the ocean and arrived in Wano. Guys, as a possibility, what this suggests to me is perhaps Wano itself is underwater. Sanji even mentioned later on in the story that they went looking for Luffy at the bottom of the ocean, where they did happen to find his Vivre card, but not him. So I want you guys to keep this in mind, but let's move forward. So yeah, let's talk about some other things that I observed. Guys, it is my suspicion, based on certain things that I've seen within Wano Kuni, that many of the mountains and the rock itself is hollow. And moreover, much of the water itself of Wano Kuni is contained within aquifers. Aquifers meaning essentially rivers that flow underneath the earth itself. The reason why this occurred to me has to do with the Paradise Farm located within Bakura Town. If you guys remember, the town of leftovers, none of their food is good, everything is poisoned, the water is contaminated, everything, you can't eat it. But however, in Bakura, where Orochi's and Kaido's subordinates reside, they have healthy, good-to-eat food because of the Paradise Farm. And so in chapter 917, we actually got to visit the Paradise Farm, which is stated to be deep within Bakura Town. I take deep to mean underground. And as we see Speed leave the Paradise Farm, she opens up some huge ass doors which seem to be in the side of some kind of mountain. I think that this is further confirmed when we later visit Odin Castle. The mountain upon which Odin Castle resides also has a huge door in the side of it, suggesting that it, as well as the mountain beside Bakura Town, is hollow. You can actually go inside of it. But as we get to see the Paradise Farm, what struck me as the most interesting is that within this mountain, this hollow mountain, you have flowing water and a waterfall. I find these two things to be related. If you have an underground river, then it isn't out of the question for there to be a large opening within the mountain itself. To me, it just does not seem to be very efficient for the citizens of Wano and the samurai to bother to carve out the insides of multiple mountains unless those were things that were already the case. They were already hollow. And if you think about this further, you would realize that for the people that live in Kuri, their access to fresh, drinkable water is very, very limited. Yet there appears to be a clean source of water literally right there, right where they should be, yet they can't drink from it. At least not without going inside of the Paradise Farm within this mountain. So my explanation for this, guys, is that yes, it is there, but it is not easily accessed, i.e. the river exists underground. If you happen to want to drink fresh water from it, you'd actually have to dig into the surface. The entry point to collect it happens to be inside of this hollow mountain. So for whatever reason, guys, what I'm saying is that Wano's mountains and possibly the ground itself is hollow, with flowing rivers underneath. Perhaps you could describe it as a giant cave-like structure. I could sit here and argue every little thing that has occurred to me, which helps me rationalize this as my belief, but it would take far too long. It's just, honestly, it would be extremely boring. Many minutes focused on very subjective bits of information that would require a lot of argumentation. So we're just going to go ahead and leave that out, and I'm just going to let you know that there are other things that I've noticed which contributes to this thought. I suppose some of you right now are wondering, JB, okay, we'll bite, right? You think that Wano is cave-like, maybe has lots of holes in it, water passes under the ground. What's the purpose of all this? Where is this leading towards? And guys, the reason that I find this to be very, very useful information to deduce is because of how Luffy ended up in Wano to begin with. They seem to have climbed up a waterfall to the top of what appears to be, for lack of better terms, a basin with a whirlpool in it, dragging people, supposedly according to Sanji, down to the bottom of the ocean. In order for this to make sense, guys, then that would mean that this earth that we see sticking out of the ground, this basin, is much the same as a giant tube, making it, wait for it, hollow. Just the same as I'm speculating about Wano in general. I don't believe this to be a coincidence. So guys, keep in mind everything that we know of from Wano that we suspect or know is a clue, such as Kinemon mentioned that there's some kind of bend and that matters for some reason, and we know that a freshwater current just appeared seemingly out of the bottom of the ocean. We can see the air bubbling up from it, and within this freshwater current we find a carp, which are only present in fresh water itself. In order to enter Wano, Luffy first had to be, it seems like, submerged into a kind of whirlpool which dragged him to the bottom of the ocean. Meanwhile, the fresh water is so clear that it reminds Brooks of the currents and streams that pass down a mountain. And I further speculated that the geography or the geology of Wano itself seems to have various spiky structures, mountainous-like structures that just naturally exist. We can see them outside of Wano within the ocean, as well as in Wano itself. And some of the rocks themselves may be hollow. And I speculated that maybe a giant version of one of these hollow rocks is what drew Luffy down to the bottom of the ocean, into the whirlpool. Now watch this, guys. We will talk about it afterwards.
It doesn't look that complicated, this collection of hardware store materials, but it may represent a breakthrough in cleaning up polluted water near coal mines. Even more compelling, this device is actually a revived 16th century technology that uses no electricity and requires little maintenance. Call it simple and sustainable. This is a Tromp.
Water comes in here and falls down this vertical pipe. At the same time, air is entrained, and the velocity of the water carries the air bubbles down to the bottom here, where we change direction and the pipe enlarges. The water bubbles then float to the top and are captured in these reservoirs. The bulk of the air is captured in the first one, and the remnants are captured in the second. Then the water without air comes out the discharge pipe and is discharged here.
The irony is, the same reason people abandon using Tromps is why it's attractive for use here. It doesn't need electricity or any other power, just water and gravity.
Now for some of you, maybe the light bulb clicked on. For others, maybe not. Maybe you need further explanation. But before we explain it, guys, I want to get to the point. I want to get to what it is that I am speculating, what it is that I think might be the case. I think that Wano might exist within a natural, geological Tromp. More specifically, guys, I want to speculate that Wano actually exists within the giant One Piece mountain and is only accessible from underwater, where its air supply exists as an air bubble. Here I'm going to provide you a diagram in which I drew explaining the concept. Don't get overwhelmed by the amount of information yet, and also don't look too much into it. It will be used to sort of visually describe some of the things that I'm talking about. So yeah, let's talk about the Tromp in a little bit more detail and how it could apply to One Piece, how Oda could be using it. So essentially, what you need to have is you need to have some kind of tunnel or tube in which water can fall into. But what is most critical is that as the water falls into this tube, it takes air bubbles with it. These air bubbles cannot escape and are dragged down to the bottom of whatever source of water. And so there's two ways in which this can work. Either can apply to this particular case. On one hand, you could have a giant hole in the ocean similar to Enies Lobby. As you can see, Enies Lobby is like this gigantic hole with waterfall. As the water is falling into this hole, so is air. It actually captures a bit of the air as it falls in. Or if the force created from the waterfall itself is not enough, what you can have is you can have alternative sources of tunnels. Essentially, you can have alternative tubes sticking out of it that are not underwater, but rather stick above the water. I've specifically drawn these in the diagram. So as the water falls into the giant tube, it creates vacuum effects from the adjoining tubes, which are connected to air, so the vacuum draws the air into the stream. So from One Piece and Wano, essentially I'm speculating that the whirlpool that drew Luffy underneath the ocean was either the main tube or one of these adjoining tubes, bringing both water and air bubbles down to the bottom of the ocean. From here, the force carries them down until the tube reaches its bend. Kinemon specifically brought up a bend, and I don't know if anybody has any idea what that means. This is the absolute best idea for what the bend could be. And so once it bends, guys, the tunnel enlarges and enters into a giant chamber. My thought is that this is a giant chamber from the hollowed out inside of One Piece's greatest mountain. This chamber is where you would find Wano, and so Wano receives its air because of the air bubbles that are brought to the bottom of the ocean. Once they reach this chamber, the air bubbles then float up to the surface and separate, creating Wano's air bubble. Now guys, because the water actually cycles and flows through the trump, new air is brought in all the time. So their air would never go stale, which is not something that you would find if you just had a random, underwater cave. The hydrodynamics of the trump is important. The water flow would help to regulate the atmospheric composition, probably in addition to Wano's own plant life. Really, the only difference between the air that would be present within this chamber or this cave within the mountain and the outside world is the pressure. Depending on how deep a Wano exists underneath the ocean would change its atmospheric pressure. A trompe is essentially a very simple air compressor, but usually when you're talking about air compressors, you're talking about the air being heated up in the process. It creates energy. But in the case of a trompe, it does not actually heat the air at all because of the flowing water. The flowing water acts to cool the air. So I think that you would be left with either cooler or the same temperature of atmosphere as on the surface. The only real thing that you need after this is some kind of exit shaft, allowing the water to continue to flow outside of the system. As the water would leave this exit shaft, I would assume that it would create a very powerful ocean current. And I believe that is exactly what Oda showed us when we get to see the bubble depicted in this panel. The current and the fish and the bubbles all seem to come from under the ocean itself. I think that this suggests, similar to the fact that Luffy had to be dragged underneath the water to arrive in Wano in the first place, that to get to Wano, it is in some way related or found underneath the ocean. And so from here, guys, the only thing left that we really need to explain is how the freshwater currents exist in the first place. Where did all the fresh water come from? And this is pretty easy because Brooks suggested it. A giant one-piece mountain. Just not the one that Oda is leading us to believe. It's stated that the weather surrounding Wano is absolutely terrible. I am assuming that it is storming all the time. This storm water, which would be fresh water, would come down on the mountain and collect in streams. Because of the absurd height of this mountain, these streams would be traveling at an incredible pace as they reach where the mountain meets the ocean. Because there's a different density between fresh water and salt water, and because of the speed at which the fresh water is traveling, it doesn't quickly diffuse into the ocean. It remains a freshwater stream. From here, the fresh water is literally sucked into a hole in the ocean. The giant tube we were talking about earlier. The very same that carried Luffy to Wano. This tube, I'm speculating, is actually a part of the giant mountain. For whatever reason, this mountain produces a spiky mountain, some of which are hollow, some of which are not, of various sizes, which we can see within the mountain itself from Wano. Because although Wano exists within the mountain, it is comprised of the very same material. So the kind of features that we would see in Wano would be the same kind of features that we would see on the mountain. So yeah, as complicated as it may have seemed beforehand, it seems relatively simple to me. The fresh water then sucked underneath and within the mountain and then exits, and it creates a loop. For the most part, this explains every single little detail that Oda has given us as to what could hint for how Wano works. Really, the only issue with this theory at all is that it introduced another question, which is if Wano is within the giant mountain, how exactly is it light outside? It should be in a cave, it should be dark. And so for the most part, I'm just going to leave this in Oda's hands. Oda is capable of doing some magical things which somehow end up making sense because One Piece and Oda. Like for instance, in Fishman Island you have a tree that glows, in Eni's lobby it is always sunny, or even looking specifically at Wano Kuni, we have only been inside one of these hollow mountains one time. We got to see it with the Paradise Farm. But the Paradise Farm, as far as I'm aware, should be within a mountain. It should also be a cave, yet it seems to be light inside of there. Now, we haven't seen a lot of it. It doesn't seem to be lights out, but theoretically, maybe the inside of these caves just glow. Who knows? But for sure, one thing that we have yet to see in Wano, and I think that it is conspicuously absent because Oda loves to draw either one of the two, is we have yet to see a sun, and we have yet to see a moon. Makes sense if Wano is actually below the surface. Another thing worth pointing out to you guys is that for some reason it is stormy. The weather is terrible around Wano, but not over Wano. Again, doesn't make a whole lot of sense unless Wano is actually under the ground. You talk about Wano being isolated, well, there's no better place to be isolated than within a giant mountain. So yeah guys, that is what I wanted to talk about today, but as always, I am curious as to feedback and your thoughts about it. This is one of those things that is enormously complicated, and it was kind of difficult to break down what it is that I wanted to explain and how I wanted to explain it, and I have no doubt that I probably made a few missteps which might have lost people. Or on the other hand, just made a mistake. So as always, share your thoughts in the comment section below. Last thing I want to add is that the diagram that I drew for this is extremely simple, and it does not need to be this simple. It could be much more complicated. Potentially, I'm not sure about the hydrodynamics and the physics behind this. People who know more can probably add their inputs, but potentially you could have multiple points of entry into the mountain and multiple points of exit. Which is why I brought up the idea that there are many hollow structures within Wano. But yeah, like the video if you liked the video, dislike the video if you disliked the video, make sure to subscribe if you want to be notified for my future content, and as always guys, have a wonderful day.